Hola a todos, mi nombre es Cristal y soy parte de la colectiva de justicia del lenguaje Comal y soy una de las intérpretes de hoy. Estoy aquí con mi cointérprete DJ.
Hello, everyone. My name is DJ, and I'm with Comal Language Justice Collective, and I'm one of the interpreters here today with my co-interpreter, Cristal.
Primero que nada, quiero agradecer a Texas Appleseed por priorizar la justicia del lenguaje.
First, I want to thank Texas Appleseed for prioritizing language justice.
La justicia del lenguaje es el derecho a participar plenamente con el idioma que la persona se sienta más cómoda. Nosotros creemos que la justicia se puede alcanzar a través de la solidaridad significativa que trasciende las barreras lingüísticas.
Language justice is the right to participate fully with the language a person feels most comfortable. We believe that justice can be achieved through meaningful solidarity that transcends language barriers.
Esta presentación será en inglés con interpretación disponible en español. Todos somos responsables en crear este espacio, por eso les queremos recordar de unas pautas el día de hoy. Recuerden que cada uno de nosotros compartimos estas responsabilidades.
This presentation is in English with Spanish interpretation. We are all responsible for creating this space, and we want to remind you of a few guidelines today. Remember, each one of us shares this responsibility.
Entonces, primero, cuando la interpretación se haga disponible, podrán ver el globo terráqueo donde podrán elegir el lenguaje en el que quieran participar. O si están en su celular, en la aplicación, podrán hacerlo al hacer clic en los tres puntitos. Si no quieren escuchar el audio original de la presentación, pueden apagarlo.
When the interpretation is enabled, you will see a globe where you can choose your language you are participating in. Or if you're using the app on your phone, you can do so by clicking the three dots. If you do not want to hear the original audio, you may turn it off.
En conclusión, si tiene algún problema con la interpretación, por favor de comunicarse por el chat o simplemente digan algo y no sufran en silencio.
Finally, if you have any problems with the interpretation, please communicate in the chat or say something and do not suffer in silence.
Muchas gracias, eso es todo. Pueden ya encender la función de interpretación y dar unos cuantos segundos para que todos puedan encontrar el botón y elegir el idioma en el que quieran participar.
Thank you very much. That is all. You may now turn on the interpretation function and give a few seconds so everyone can find the button and choose the language they want to participate in.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining the Texas Lege Chat from Texas Appleseed. My name is Ann Bedour, and I'm the director of the Fair Financial Services Project at Texas Appleseed. We'll be covering two different issue areas in this webinar, both fair financial services and fair housing, but we're going to lead off with a conversation about fair financial services. I'm really excited to have two of our great community partners, Cornelius Blackshear with Mission United and the United Way of Greater Houston. He directs a lot of their veterans facing work, and we'll talk a lot about how high cost lending impacts veterans. And Catherine Ibarra with the Texas Access to Justice Commission, who's going to be part of our first presentation, which looks at debt collection. And we're focusing on these two issue areas because of how closely they tie in with the financial hardship that many families are facing right now as we recover from the pandemic and then the added burdens of the winter storm. And the focus of our work is really around building financial well-being and resilience to create successful families and successful local economies. And so I'm looking forward to having some great conversations. I want to start by looking at some basic data just to help us put some numbers to a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing happen in our communities. This first chart looks at how Texas households are doing. The gray bar looks at how folks were doing before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, 44% of households were struggling to make ends meet. And that number comes from some really important work that United Ways of Texas and other United Ways have been doing around looking at well-being for Texas families. In the most recent census pulse, and the census has done some great data collection on how families have been doing, we found that 60% of Texas households were struggling to make ends meet. And when you look at families who have incomes of under $50,000 a year, it's fully 81%. And I think the disparity in income is particularly marked when you parse that data a little bit. So for families earning less than $50,000 a year, almost 30% were having severe struggles. So looking at the most impacted and most struggling, looking at under 50,000, it was 10% of households. So it just is to give you some framing that a lot of Texans are struggling right now. And it's really important that we look at policies that bolster families in the moment and help people rebuild as we move forward from this time. So I want to start by talking about our first issue, which is debt collection reform. And I'm excited to tell you that Texas Appleseed today just released a very large data study on, or not large in length, but large in coverage, of looking at debt collection lawsuits in Texas and documenting some concerning trends we've been seeing, both in the area of access to justice and racial equity. The access to justice concerns are around people's ability to participate in the court process. This chart shows some data. It's a little bit technical because it looks at how the outcomes of judgments have played out for debt collection lawsuits. But the main takeaway is that in 65% of the cases, the people sued, mostly for smaller debts averaging $3,000 or less, are not able to engage in the court process for whatever reason. And so there's a default judgment that's issued against them. And this was during the pandemic when access to the courts was limited. And so it's particularly marked that people are having this barriers to participate in the process. And that's a top line access to justice concern. And when we put this data on top of some of the racial equity impacts that we've documented in our new study, showing that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by very aggressive lawsuit filings, it creates this dual crisis that comes together in terms of how families are faring in the system. And so I want to transition to a conversation with Catherine Ibarra with the Texas Access to Justice Commission, and to talk about the problems that they're seeing, as well as some really encouraging legislation. So Catherine, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thanks, Anne.
So I wanted to start out the conversation with just a very basic question. Why are the current problems that we're seeing, these high rates of default judgment and the lack of people's ability to participate in the process, why are these access to justice issues, why are they important for Texans?
Sure. So just to start, the Texas Access to Justice Commission was created by the Texas Supreme Court to increase access to the civil justice system for people who can't afford a lawyer. So we serve as a statewide umbrella organization for all efforts to expand access and reduce barriers like the ones you were talking about in the justice in civil legal matters. And so access to justice is more than just actual access to the courthouse or the judicial system. It means improving fairness and meaningful participation in the legal process. And addressing the ATJ barriers in the process itself then will promote better outcomes and just outcomes, and it enhances the overall credibility of the justice system. So when we look at ways to address systemic barriers to ATJ in debt cases, bridging this gap has to include policies that will help Texans help themselves. And then under the current debt process, like you mentioned, we're seeing a very small number of consumer defendants participating in the court process. And the judgment debtors also don't have tools to assert their rights in any post-judgment collection process. And then we also see a need to protect against the seizure of entire bank accounts. It's a practice that leaves people without funds to meet their basic needs. We want to make sure that the court system and process is accessible and it works. And when we see situations like what we're seeing with debt claim cases, it's concerning because we know that people don't have tools to empower themselves to navigate this legal process. Like you're saying, the data shows that debt cases are dominating in the growth trend in civil filings, not only in district and county courts, but especially in justice courts. And when we have this increasing rate of filings, we are also seeing that default rate remaining high, which is indicative to barriers to the justice system or other ATJ concerns. It's suggesting that it's largely a one-sided process. And that's because challenging a garnishment or a seizure is really hard. It's difficult, it takes time, and it generally requires an attorney. And so the burden in these situations is typically then placed on impacted Texans to know what money is exempt and figure out how to engage in that legal process to try and retrieve any of that exempt money. And most people, like the everyday person, simply can't navigate that process and end up losing all of their funds, including money that should be exempt, like unemployment insurance or FEMA benefits, or even child support or spousal support.
So what you're talking about in these post-judgment collections, it connects with the high rate of people getting these default judgments against them where they're just, for whatever reason, are struggling to participate in the process. The back end of that is that people often, and it can be 5-10 years after that court judgment, will suddenly not be able to access any of the money in their account and have a new financial crisis.
Exactly.
So, talking about the pandemic and the winter storm, are there any specific issues with access to justice that interact with the time that we're in right now?
Yeah, definitely. So debt collection increases in times of economic hardship, which is making it important to address the problems that we see in the debt collection process right now so that Texans can recover financially while they're still able to repay their debts. So we have unexpected expenses from the winter storm that blasted the entire state in February, on top of the new financial insecurities resulting from this ongoing pandemic that have added urgency to improve the fairness and injustice in the debt collection process. And one of the issues that was highlighted during the past year over the course of the pandemic is that there is no clear state law exemption to protect funds like we received through the CARES Act, like the economic impact payments. So even though FEMA benefits, stimulus funds, unemployment insurance should be exempt from debt collection, they're hard to protect currently. And often these funds end up being frozen or seized because the everyday person isn't able to navigate that process to get them back. And like you're saying, a court judgment from 10 years ago or earlier could be used by a creditor to take those FEMA benefits just received from an account of a URI survivor or their disaster unemployment insurance, particularly if those funds are mixed with any non-exempt funds. So a basic needs cash exemption would protect a minimum amount in a bank account to ensure that we aren't pushed into a renewed financial crisis in the midst of these ongoing crises because of an old debt collection action.
So can you talk just briefly, we have these bills, Senate Bill 644 and House Bill 3613. Can you just tell us briefly how these bills that are currently pending in the legislature can help address the issues that we've been talking about?
Sure. These are really exciting bills that generally modernize that wage exemption. We've had long-standing laws in Texas to protect wages, to keep them exempt from debt collection, both through our Constitution and the Property Code. The provision in the Constitution was adopted in 1876, and it's only been amended twice to allow for narrow exceptions for child support and spousal support. But these laws date back to a time when most people were paid by cash or check, predating now the common practice of direct deposit. And as a direct result, there's no explicit protection of those wages once they're deposited, making them subject to garnishment. Because of this intermingling, that old judgment can end up, with the person losing everything, including the exempt assets. So these exempt funds being seized creates a crisis, leaving someone not able to meet the basic living expenses. So this bill will also protect a minimum amount of money deposited into an account from garnishment and seizure. There are 37 other states that protect either all of the deposited wages or a certain amount of funds for basic living needs. And originally, as this bill was filed, that amount we were trying to protect was equal to the monthly equivalent of 250% of the federal poverty guidelines for a family of 4, which would ensure Texans have enough money in bank accounts to pay rent, buy food, cover their bills, remain off public benefits. But for simplicity's sake, and to make it clear to banks and those seeking to assert this exemption, I believe the committee said we'll set this amount to a flat $3,000. While still allowing a creditor to seize a base amount to fulfill any court-ordered alimony, child support, or other obligations like that. Ideally, this basic needs exemption would be self-executing, and going into the interim, we'll try to work with stakeholders so that it can be so. But I think one of the really important parts of these bills is that it creates a very simple process to navigate this exemption. The Supreme Court will establish rules for setting expedited procedures, simple procedures, and a prompt hearing. And it will also require a plain language notice that will be provided by the 3rd day after an account is seized. It'll be in English and Spanish and include a plain language form to assert this exemption. So we're really excited about these.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for being a part of this conversation. And just, some of these issues sound very technical. It's about court judgments and different types of collection mechanisms, words that we might not always use in our everyday life, but the impacts on people are very real. I have received pleas for help from someone whose main income was unemployment insurance during the pandemic, and their whole account was seized and they had no money suddenly. They needed a lawyer, and I was able to help connect them to a lawyer, but there are thousands and thousands of Texans in that same predicament who can't find a lawyer. And so I think the hope for this bill, like Catherine said, we want to keep people on financially stable, off of public benefits, not falling into new crisis, while still maintaining their obligations to pay their debts. And so we're really hopeful that some of these measures will move through as we think about ways to sustain families financially and rebuild our families and our local economies moving forward. So the next issue that I want to pivot to is in many ways the other side of this. So we have debt collection when people get caught up in unaffordable debts or identity theft, or maybe even are wrongfully sued, all situations that can happen. On the other side, we have high cost lending. And Texas recently got the honor of having the honor, I say in with a bit of sarcasm, and having some of the highest rates in the country for payday loans. You can see different kinds of lending rates for banks and credit unions. Generally, those loans are capped at 18%. The highest rates for licensed finance companies are around 100%. They range from 90 to 113% for the annual percentage rate. And payday and auto title loans are oftentimes at 600% interest or higher. What that means over a 6-month loan, which more and more is typical for what these loans are looking like, a $500 loan can cost more than $1,600 to repay. We just saw the latest data that came out. So the state collects data on payday and auto title lending. And one of the very concerning trends that I'm seeing in the fourth quarter data is an uptick in auto title lending as well as repossessions from auto title lenders. So just to explain the two products, a payday loan is generally secured by some kind of direct access to a bank account, and an auto title loan is generally secured by access to people's cars. And the uptick in the fourth quarter is concerning because we saw a lot of the pandemic relief benefits go away at that point. A lot of the unemployment insurance boost, the stimulus was long spent, and that people were in such a desperate place that they were taking their last asset, their car, and trying to get some extra money. But even though we've had some additional support since that time period, once people get caught up in one of these loans, it's really, really hard to get out. And Cornelius and I will be talking about that a little bit more further on. But the next slide looks at a particularly vulnerable community in Texas, and one that we're very proud of. Texas has a large veteran population, one of the largest in the country. We have many military installations. And in 2019, we conducted a survey of veterans in Texas and found that veterans were disproportionately impacted by payday and auto title lending. And this chart shows that 76% of the veterans we surveyed who had used a payday or auto title loan had trouble paying it back because of these very high costs and terms. And so I wanted to bring in Cornelius, who works very closely with the veterans community in Houston, to have a little conversation about how the impacts he's been seeing on the ground, as well as some of the bills that we're hoping to see considered in the legislature this session. Hi, Cornelius, welcome.
Thank you, Ann and team, for having me out this morning.
So it's great to have you here. And I'd love for you to give us a picture of, based on the experiences of the United Way of Greater Houston and your specific work with veterans, how have you seen high cost lending, including payday and auto title lending, impact veterans and other people, particularly during the hardship of the current pandemic and the aftermath of the winter storm?
So, Ann, thank you for allowing me to share. You all know that prior to COVID, veterans were the targeted population for a lot of auto loan and payday lenders, not only with their active duty components, but we also had a large National Guard and Reserve component units here in the Gulf Coast region. And both in studies and surveys that we've done since COVID-19 started, and in direct reporting from a lot of the agencies that we work with, auto title loans specifically has increased since COVID-19 started. I will share a couple of very quick stories and try and circle back. So we had a young man who was a student who was receiving VA benefits and his educational benefits from the VA. He contracted COVID and had to disenroll from school. So just to meet his basic needs for housing and for employment, because he was a work study student as well. And when he stopped school, his work study ended. This young man went out and put his car into an auto title loan. And when he got healthy and back on his feet, his finances were in such disarray that when he went to the veteran service groups that offer financial assistance and kind of basic needs assistance in the short term, none of them could help him because the interest rates and the back pay on this auto title loan was something that he could not qualify for. This young man, again, ended up not going back to school. He ended up moving back home with his parents, and his parents are using some of their savings to help this gentleman, a veteran, get out of debt with just this one auto title loan that he had, again, because of his health, because of not receiving his educational benefits, and because of his excessive loan. This young man hopes to go back to school this fall, but there's no guarantee because, again, his parents are still living on a fixed income and they have some savings, but it has been a hardship that all of our veteran service groups have stated that they're working with. Prior to and since COVID, those loans are things that they're out actually seeking veterans and veteran family members to get them into this cycle of debt where they're paying these excessive amounts.
It's interesting that you talk about impacts during the pandemic. One of the things, Texas Appleseed released a report earlier in the year that documented I think it was over $40 million in pandemic relief. So these are loans, free either PPP loans that are forgivable or highly subsidized loans went to these very high cost lenders. And in return, they continued to lend to Texans at 3, 4, 5, and 600% APR, repossess cars.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of the experiences that you had with your clients during the winter storm? Did you see this kind of lending come up or any repercussions from these high cost loans?
I will share, and I've been doing this work with veterans in the veterans community for over 15 years. And probably the saddest story that I have heard was a story from one of our veteran service groups here in Houston. Again, we were all affected by the winter storm. There was a veteran who was deployed prior to, a female veteran, and she had her children that were here in Houston with their grandmother. Well, the grandmother, of course, took the veteran's car and got an auto title loan trying to help with supplementing some of their income. So the veteran was deployed. During the time right before the winter storm, she deployed back here to Houston, knowing that her car had this auto title loan and not having the income or the resources, because again, she was a reservist and didn't have a full-time job, but the family needed food and basic needs, things taken care of. During the winter storm, during the time that the power was out here in Houston, the auto title loan had already gone through the court systems and the whole nine and set that car up for repossession. Other than having the apartment that they were in where the pipes were burst, the car was the only area that that family could go to be warm and kind of be out of the elements. While they were in the house kind of preparing food and meals and things along that line, the veteran's car was repossessed. So that took the only safe place, the only place of comfort and heat for that family, all because, again, of an auto title loan and not knowing what the outcomes and the consequences of not paying it or communicating with the agency at a reasonable time. And again, all of our VSOs, veteran service groups, were affected, but as they are kind of coming back online, we've actually done a couple of virtual outreach events out in the community, and we had 2 meetings this past week out in the Houston 3rd Ward area, which is a very low income area. And for the veterans that we contacted there, they all either have a payday loan or an auto title loan that they have used to try and supplement basic needs. When we're going out to these food pantries and the veterans are in line, they're coming to get food, money, and their resources and benefits are going to pay off these loans that they've had to go out and get just to meet, their everyday needs. So it's, again, very sad, but those are the things we have seen an uptick, specifically in auto title, but also in the payday loans.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's what we hear from partners around the state, that people get caught up in payday and auto title loans, and then they have to resort to food banks and rent assistance and direct service providers that spend millions of dollars meeting needs that are really caused by these very high cost loans. And I think you raised some very interesting points, because it's important. People need access to credit. We need access to credit in our community, but not access to abusive credit. And when you start to get at 5, 6, 700% APR with terms, many of these loans, none of the payments actually pay down the loan. So people may be making their payment month after month after month, and they still owe the same amount of money. It starts to become something that pulls people down instead of lifting them up. We think of credit as something that boosts us in a time of need or helps us equalize or even our expenditures. But what we see in our communities is that these loans are pulling people down. I heard a pastor from Dallas once talked about these loans as instead of throwing someone a life vest or a lifesaver when they're drowning, you throw them an anchor. And that's what we see time and time again on the impacts of these loans. So there are some really exciting things happening in the area of better loan products. We're seeing community-based lenders and banks and credit unions starting to engage more in that market to offer people better options, which is really great. But I wanted to talk about some bills that are pending right now at the legislature and some policies to think about from the policy perspective. What do you think would be helpful for the people that you serve to really start to rein in some of the most abusive practices we're seeing?
I know that some of the local ordinances are important, but again, any bill that's going to help veterans with the Veterans Payday Lending Act, whether it be a federal, state, or local group, will be important. I definitely would like to see us create safer consumer loan options. Again, through our United Way Thrive program, we work with both the veteran service groups and those in our community to try and make these things happen. But we need the support of our legislator to make these things come to pass.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And so we're going to move on to a very quick Q&A. It looks like we have a few questions posted. We'll talk about one or two of them and then move on to the next section just in the interest of time. So one of the questions that came up is about data and state records and where is that information available? So the main source of that information is the Texas Office of Consumer Credit Commissioner. And that's where you can find data on payday and auto title lending in Texas. I will give one caveat that not to go into too much detail, but there's a new loophole that's opened up with another category of lending that we don't have data on, but that's the most complete data that we have available in Texas. And the other thing that, another question that came up is information about, where do people go for help? And I urge people to look at the email that we're going to be sending as a follow-up. And Cornelius has graciously shared a lot of United Way-based resources that are a great resource to help people who find themselves in financial difficulty. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Maddie Sloan, who will be leading up the conversation on disaster recovery and fair housing. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Anne. And thank you again to everyone for being here. The goal of our disaster recovery and fair housing project is to ensure that all Texans get an equitable amount of disaster recovery resources, particularly some of the state and federal funds in particular that come to Texas. And not only that we don't leave certain Texans and certain communities behind, but that as an ongoing agenda, we are trying to make sure that those communities are more resilient and better prepared for future disasters. And I am very excited to have Chriselle Pillay, the Executive Director of the Home Coalition, the Houston Organizing Movement for Equity, who has worked on these issues for a very long time. Chriselle, what disaster recovery and fair housing seems somewhat unrelated. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to think about them together?
Yes, so again, I'm Chriselle Pillay with the Home Coalition. And so, yes, Maddie, it's very clear that there is, direct commonalities when it comes to disaster recovery and fair housing. We see the continual impacts of segregation, historical discrimination and disinvestment, from racial wealth gaps to exposures to environmental hazards. And what we see is that when natural disasters happen, the disparity is deepened and the correlation to disaster recovery and fair housing become even clearer. There's a less likelihood to recover. There's a less likelihood to thrive. And I've been doing this work for over 10 years now. And unfortunately, after witnessing the devastation after Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Harvey, Imelda, COVID, and now the winter storm, poor families of color continue to be left behind more and more. And even when you look at this map of social vulnerability, and this map is including factors of unemployment, poverty, race, ethnicity, we can see the ongoing COVID disaster, compared to a map of social vulnerability and where there's overlap.
And one of the impacts of COVID-19 and the winter storm on lower income households and people who've experienced economic hardship during the last year. And I'll refer everyone back to Ann's slide on how Texans are doing based on their income. But that loss of income is particularly critical because it can result in an eviction. And can we have the next slide, please? When we look at, the unemployment rate is still double what it was. And when you look at data from the Census Household Pulse Survey, where we are right now is that there are an estimated 1.5 million Texas families at risk of eviction. 30 to 40 million families nationwide, but 1.5 million families in Texas. Chriselle, isn't there a federal moratorium blocking evictions?
So there is a federal CDC moratorium in place, but unfortunately it is not being enforced. There are several factors, there are several loopholes that basically are in place that by and large, largely benefit landlords, where tenants ultimately do not end up being covered by the CDC moratorium, the federal CDC moratorium. Additionally, the Supreme Court of Texas has declined to extend their emergency order. And basically they're just telling judges that, that it's up to them to enforce the order. And so local judges then have the authority to either move forward with the eviction, even if there is a CDC declaration. And even if the eviction is illegal, they can make that judgment. And then also additionally, the Texas eviction diversion program money is not moving fast enough at all. And there are several landlords that are refusing to even accept that assistance.
And one note I wanted to make about the Texas eviction diversion program is that one of the benefits that happens for tenants, landlords get the full amount of rent, but the eviction record is sealed so that the eviction can't be used against families in the future. Next slide, please. So evictions have extremely severe negative effects. I mean, Chriselle, what have you seen in terms of impacts on families?
Well, we're seeing that there, of course, is a higher likelihood of the spread of COVID-19 because when families are evicted, of course, they have nowhere to go. And then oftentimes what happens is they end up doubling up. And even when families are doubling up, this sometimes gives the landlord, or landlords are using this in many cases, again, as a loophole to evict basing their reasoning on the breach of the contract or the tenant, so that the CDC moratorium declaration will not go into effect. That's one of the many factors that we're seeing. Also, we're seeing ongoing issues, of course, with health, financial security, educational outcomes. Children many times either are not attending school or are having to move around from school, not even having access to internet, for virtual learning situations. So it is severely negative outcomes and effects on families.
And there are also negative outcomes generally for Texas. The eviction of 1 million Texas families would cost the state almost $1 billion. Based on past spending, Appleseed calculated that, in terms of emergency shelter, inpatient medical care, emergency room care, and foster care, costs would increase again by almost $1 billion. And I would note, again, that this is based on past spending. It doesn't include any additional COVID-related costs that would go along with spending on those issues. And I think the really important, issue that Chrishell has talked about is that evictions affect families' ability to find housing in the future. Having an eviction case can prevent people from finding housing for up to 7 years, even if they were not actually evicted.
Right.
So, you don't have to be actually evicted. Once your landlord files a case, there are credit reporting agencies and third-party companies who collect this information and, sell it to landlords, without confirming, that it's even correct or that an eviction happened. So, the tenant may have won the case, the landlord may have dismissed it, the judge may have dismissed it, but because that filing happened, that family, the information that the eviction was filed can still be used by landlords and is still used by landlords to deny families housing. So we are watching and supporting two bills in the legislature this session, one of which is HB 1647 that would limit action to eviction case information for the credit reporting and third-party agencies, who create these tenant screening reports. If the tenant won the case was dismissed without any judgment in favor of the landlord, the court has to make the eviction case information confidential. And it can also do so if doing that is in the interest of justice, which, in a lot of cases, if you lost your job during COVID, if, your child had cancer and you had to pay medical bills, it may be in the interest of justice for the courts to make that information confidential, because that situation isn't ongoing and you have ability to pay rent. Again, the limit is that these third-party reporting agencies can't disclose that the case exists or use the information in a tenant screening report, and there are actual penalties attached. I'm going to note that there are a lot of issues with the accuracy of these reports, and that, technically, under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, these screening companies are supposed to be checking for accuracy, but people find that, there's a screening report that has an eviction that wasn't theirs, someone in a similar name. So all of that is a real ongoing issue, and limiting this access to eviction information is going to help families recover and get the kind of housing stability that prevents, the kind of negative impacts Chrishell was talking about. The second bill on evictions that we're watching is HB 4444 that would give counties the power to temporarily halt evictions during a disaster declaration. We think this is, important. Cities can already do this, but often in the aftermath of disaster, tenants will be served with an eviction notice when they're still displaced. It may be critically important to keep people in housing in order to limit the effects of a disaster. And, local government should have the power to look at what's happening in their community and what the risks are to their residents and make a decision about what's the best way to stop the harm of a disaster. The other disaster that is ongoing in Texas right now are the Texas winter storms. And Chriselle, what has the impact been on communities and on Texans?
So the impact has been devastating, especially to historically underserved communities. We know for a fact right now that it's been documented that 194 Texans died, but we are pretty certain that that number is being underreported. 50% or 74% of the people who have, of the people that died that have been documented were people of color, and 50% of those were 65 years old or older. And we know that Texans lost power for an average of about 4 days. And many Texans lost running water for an average of more than 2 days. And even today, months after the storm, there are Texans that still don't have running water. We have, specifically, there are several apartment complexes where the water lines were damaged and the repairs still have not been made. Food replacement, it has been a continual issue. I actually live in a historically African-American community, and I see on a weekly basis the lines of people that line up in their cars for the food fair and the food bank still needing food right now. Income has also been lost as well. Folks haven't been able to go to work, and some businesses were actually shut down or closed down. Plumbing repair bills have been astronomical. And one thing that we recognize as well is that in low-income communities, particularly, even if they have a plumber to come out and give them a bid, because plumbers continue to be scarce, people that are higher earners can, in a sense, outbid plumbing services. So those communities continue to be served first once again, and then these community members are continuing to wait by the wayside until someone can come out to serve them. Also, medical bills have continued to mount as well. And we know that it takes Texans at least 4 years to recover from financial damage when it's not covered by FEMA. And right now, we also know that there's an estimated $269 billion in damage overall. Right now, the most expensive disaster in Texas history. So we're in bad shape when it comes to the impacts of how this storm played out and affected community members.
What about FEMA? Isn't Texas getting help from FEMA?
So some Texans are getting help from FEMA, but not all. We know that there's a racial and socioeconomic disparity when it comes to the FEMA awards. There was a study that was done that basically showed that after Hurricane Harvey, we saw white residents of higher incomes received on average of $60,000 in assistance, while Black residents in low-income communities received on average of $84. That's $60,000 and $84. So the disparity is clear. There just continues to be this increase to the racial wealth gap over and over again. And FEMA has a large role to play in that. There are also other issues and barriers when it comes to FEMA assistance. This is a system put in place that is not accessible by those who are really in the greatest need. Also, when it comes to even filing a claim, being able to know what the thresholds are for FEMA for you to qualify. I remember specifically in Harvey, one of the issues was if you did not have water that came up to at least the electrical socket, then your home was deemed to be livable, which was not the case. Or in some cases, if you declared that you did not have a generator in your home, and that means that your home was okay. So it's almost as if there's this cryptic code, if you will, when it comes to FEMA and how to navigate FEMA in order to get the assistance that's really most needed.
And there's no direct assistance program, state program for individual survivors of a disaster. So we are watching two bills connected to, how do we get people help when they need it? Oops, and I think we have flipped a slide here, so I apologize. But the first bill is, the first bill is actually HB 3460, called the Power Act. But what it would do is create a grant program to give Texans direct financial assistance after a disaster. So Texans who earn up to 60% of area median income would be eligible, and the grants would range from $1,000 to $205,000, or I'm sorry, $2,500 based on need. So this would help families, pay electric bills, fix their plumbing, replace food, really deal with their emergency needs in a way that it is very hard to get other help to do. The second bill is HB 3543, which would create a program to help pay unusually high utility bills incurred during the winter storm. Both these bills are currently limited to the impact of the winter storm, but they are a critical precedent because this happens every time there is a disaster. And just, to let you know, there is a Facebook town hall on the Power Act if you want to learn more about it tomorrow at 6 p.m. We will send out that link in our post briefing email. And we also want to be sure that people know that it is tougher to participate in the legislative session this year because of COVID. So we will also send out some links about how to participate given COVID and the current rules. And also some information about how to find out who your state representative and senator are. It's critically important that people hear from their constituents and hear especially about people's experiences, about how these things affect them, and why they need certain programs or certain laws to be passed and those protections. Sorry, I'm navigating to the Q&A page. Well, it does not look like we have any specific questions on this. But if folks do want more information about disaster recovery and what's happening on the ground in vulnerable communities and what might help them, please feel free to contact me directly. And I know we put a lot of numbers on slides, so also happy to provide those statistics or sources of information if folks are interested in. Thank you so much for joining us. I know everyone's time is particularly stretched and valuable right now in Texas, but we really appreciate your attendance and your attention to these issues that are so important to all Texans, and particularly the most vulnerable Texans that Appleseed works to serve.